Thank you, Tori. Good morning. Nice to see you all today. Thank you all for being here. And yes, I have a sermon. I'm not just going to stand here for 15 minutes in silence, although that would be kind of cool. So it's so good to see you all. Welcome to the folks who are either here for the first time or fairly new. I see a lot of faces I've not met before. And just a reminder, again, we have a newcomer circle today. So please do consider joining us. Let's go into the social hall, which is somewhere around here. I'm so directionally challenged. Go in there and take a left, get some popcorn and head out to the patio. But I hope many of you will join us. So it's a fun time. So as a minister, when I begin to prepare for a Sunday morning service and start to look for readings, I always try to find words that, connect to the basic theme of what I'm talking about in the sermon. Sometimes the reading might have like this perfect quotation that I can then use to illustrate a point, but more often than not, I'm simply trying to bring a voice and a perspective into the service that will help you all connect more deeply with what we are exploring together on Sunday mornings. But every once in a while, I come across a book that may contain a reading that goes beyond simply connecting to a particular theme or providing the sermon with a good quote, a reading that seems to be speaking directly to me, to my life and to my spiritual journey. And that is exactly what happened the first time I came across Gunilla Norris's book, Inviting Silence. I really recommend this book. It's a little paperback. It's not long. It's very, very powerful. The reading Tori just shared, I think it's fair to say that it pretty much describes much of my own spiritual journey, and especially my experience with silence, an experience that has too often been characterized by avoidance, distraction, doing almost anything other than sitting still and being silent. But in those infrequent moments when I have experienced silence, I find myself connecting, as she describes so well, to what feels like my true self, to something so deep, honest, and peaceful that it feels as if a window opens in my heart and allows me to truly listen to what I can only describe as that sheer sound of silence. Or if you prefer, the King James translation translates the sheer sound of silence as that still, small voice, which the prophet Elijah hears when God passes by. God's not a booming earthquake or a terrifying fire. The divine is a still, small voice. So I want to begin this morning by telling you about one of my experiences with silence. Some years ago, I went on a week-long retreat. This is while I was in seminary, and it was actually part of a class at a Benedictine monastery. And I'd been looking forward to this retreat for quite some time. And here's a couple of slides, a couple of images of this particular monastery. It's located in eastern Massachusetts. That's where I went to seminary. It's called Glastonbury Abbey. It's got one of the more beautiful sort of abbey worship spaces that I've ever been in before. Maybe it's partly because it's not as old as many other abbeys are, but it's really quite beautiful. The next image, one of the things that's really unique about this place that draws folks is that when the abbey was being built in the late 50s and early 60s, a struggling young artist who some of you, especially if you're familiar with the story Stregonona, Tommy DePaulo, he painted some of the art on the walls there. That's a painting of Saint Benedict, and that's a very elderly Tommy DePaulo coming back. Actually, it's not long before he passed away. And so it's got this extraordinary art around it that done by someone that I at least have heard of. So any of you know Tommy DePaulo's work? Yeah, okay, I thought so. So anyway, those are just some of the unique things about that particular seminary. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with monastic life, life in a Benedictine monastery hasn't changed much in, I don't know, over 1,000 years. And it follows something called the Rule of Saint Benedict. The Rule is a very, very short book written during the early Middle Ages, and it's a kind of instruction manual for monks and also for nuns. The Rule is filled with advice about everything from how and when to pray, to the clothes monks should wear, and to how much food they should be allowed to eat. Now, during the retreat, my classmates and I lived pretty much according to the Rule. We attended the prayer services 5 times a day, known as the daily office, ate all of our meals together, took turns doing small chores, and yes, observed lengthy periods of silence. Now, prior to going to the monastery, I felt pretty uncertain about what this whole thing was going to be like. I never really had much luck with meditation and silence, which using a term like luck probably shows you that I was totally missing the point. In fact, as Nora says, I had spent far more time avoiding silence than experiencing it. As the retreat began, my previous struggles, and I would even say failures, there's another example of why I didn't really understand what this was all about, with silence made me wonder if I would get anything out of this retreat in which so much time was devoted to being quiet. Now, the daily period of silence at this particular monastery begins after dinner and continues until the next morning at breakfast. Of course, you spend a good part of that time sleeping, but there are several hours in the evening and then several hours after you rise in the morning in which you don't talk to anyone. You remain quiet. I remember how strange it felt that very first night as I returned to my room after dinner. I closed the door and thought to myself, now what? Should I pray, meditate, stare at the ceiling, play tic-tac-toe in my journal? Having spent so much time of my life distracted by noise, I didn't know what to do. Feeling lost and getting a little desperate, I took out that notebook and just began to jot things down. First, I tried to write about the silence, closed my eyes and said in my mind over and over again, I was probably gritting my teeth, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't quiet all the thoughts and chatter and frustration racing through my mind. So I decided, well, I don't know what else to do, so I'll just write about the noise and the chatter. Soon I began pouring out my frustration that I could never seem to turn off what the Buddha calls monkey mind, right? Oh, those monkeys jumping around in your brain. I wrote about how uncomfortable I was with silence and how disappointed I felt in not being able to really have a prayer practice or a meditation practice. I also talked about my past failed attempts at being spiritual. Before long, my journal was filling up with all kinds of negative thinking and harsh self-judgment. As I sat at my desk pouring out all this frustration and even anger, I began to wonder if, maybe I ought to just pack it up and head home. I only lived about 20 minutes from this monastery. I mean, I could have just jumped in the car. The whole silence thing, it just wasn't working for me. I needed that noise, that distraction, something, anything to take my mind away from where it kept taking me in the silence. But as I continued to pour out that anger and self-criticism, I gradually noticed a change in how I was feeling and thinking. That anger and frustration began to calm and were slowly replaced by a little more peace. I think I stopped gritting my teeth. The tone of my writing also began to change. Reading back over those words, I can see that harsh self-judgment started to give way to self-compassion and even understanding. It was almost as if one voice, a voice full of harsh judgment and condemnation and obsession with being spiritually perfect, whatever that means, was replaced by another voice, a voice that spoke from a place of love and compassion. Every time I reread my journal, I'm amazed at all that I heard and felt that night and throughout the week. After leading me to confront my feelings of spiritual inadequacy, the silence enabled me to look inside myself and listen deeply. Of course, as you heard from my experience that first night, and as Gunilla Norris makes clear, silence can be hard. It can take us to some challenging places we wouldn't normally want to go. But what was astonishing and ultimately liberating for me was that although the silence took me to a challenging place, it didn't leave me there. As difficult as it was, silence somehow led me back to love and to a wonderful feeling of blessing, companionship, and peace. What I ultimately heard and felt that week was not an earthquake or a raging fire or booming thunder from above, but rather something much closer to a still small voice, filled with compassion and love, a voice that kept telling me, you know, Tim, even though you're imperfect, terribly flawed, and pretty much a total mess, in spite of all that, you're okay. You're acceptable. You're worthy of giving and receiving love. Now, I want to be clear, I don't fully understand what that voice was or where it came from, but hearing that voice and rereading about it in the pages of my journal led me to know in my heart that there is something in my life, call it God or spirit, the heart, love. There is something that is loving and compassionate, something that lives within me and that journeys alongside me, something that is always ready to offer me comfort, hope, and peace. Hearing that voice of love in the silence also changed the way I experienced everything else that week at the monastery. You see, once the silence had somehow emptied me of my harsh self-judgment, I started hearing and seeing and feeling beauty and love everywhere. I saw them in the tree branches blowing gently in the breeze outside my window. I heard them in the voices of the monks as they chanted and prayed during the worship services. And most importantly, I felt that loving presence stir and come alive whenever I encountered others. Listening to the spirit of love inside my own heart enabled me to recognize and connect to the beauty and the spirit that lives in all. You know, sometimes I wonder about what exactly I experienced that night. Was it God or some supernatural being I was hearing? Or maybe it was the stirrings of my own heart. Ultimately, I don't know where that voice came from or in some ways, I don't think that's the point. I don't think that really matters. Maybe what matters most in such moments and in our spiritual lives in general is not the who, the cause, or the name we give to our experiences, but rather the experiences themselves. I know that the transformation I experienced that night and that week was not from one belief to another, but rather from living a life of distraction and noise to one in which I have come to be a bit more attentive and more open to the silence my spirit yearns for. I was reminded of just how much my relationship with silence has evolved some years later when I had the opportunity to go on another retreat. I know you guys are probably wondering, is this guy want to be a monk or what? I don't, but I had a chance to go on another retreat at a totally different monastery. This was the most beautiful spiritual place I've ever been to. It's an Episcopal monastery. It's located on the Hudson River. Rachel's going to show you some pictures in the Hudson River Valley. And the property is actually on the Hudson, making it a fabulous place to take long walks and experience the beauty of nature. That's across the Hudson looking out. I mean, that's a pretty good setting, wouldn't you say? My goodness, it is so beautiful there.
Where did you get all the money?
Now,
Yeah.
unlike my previous retreat,
Big
did
red.
you already see the monastery? Yeah, there it is. That's up close. So that's where I stayed, and that's where the monks live and everything. It is just a beautiful, such a beautiful place. Oh, and one other thing, this is a little bit of a witticism. Unlike every other monastery I've ever stayed at, the food is actually good. Because usually, monks divide up, they take turns at different tasks. So if you don't know how to cook, you still get assigned to do the cooking. And it can be a little unpleasant. But being in the Hudson River Valley near Hyde Park, New York, I don't know if you all are aware that the Culinary Institute of America is like a 5-mile drive from there. So I always like to tell people, yeah, they have a chef from the CIA, which is really cool. So their food was amazing. So now, unlike my previous retreat, I was on my own this time. I wasn't with a class. I just was doing an individual retreat. And this retreat, the whole thing was in silence. The only words spoken were by the monks during the prayer services and right before our meals when a blessing was offered. While the complete silence took some getting used to, and I found myself missing not being able to get to know the monks and other guests at the monastery, I once again found this silence to be a doorway to experiences of depth and beauty. I kept another journal, and this time, rather than beating myself up about that monkey mind, I just said, well, that's me. I accepted it. My thoughts wandered all over the place. I didn't want to give you the impression that I had grown into some great meditator. I was still all over the place. But this time, I wasn't worried about it. I was just free, felt free to be me. And as I had in my previous time at a monastery, the silence enabled me to experience the extraordinary in the ordinary. That's something silence really does for me. I can experience the extraordinary in the ordinary. It's almost like silence somehow opens my heart and, pardon the expression, turns on my spiritual radar. That sounds kind of funky, but I began to see and listen and feel more deeply, to hear sounds that I would have otherwise ignored, to taste the goodness in the food I ate, and to see beauty in the things that I would normally have walked past without noticing. I took a walk down to the riverside, and I think I probably would have noticed this no matter what. And I'm sitting there, and it's very quiet and so beautiful. And I hear this big rustling, and which I hadn't seen, an enormous bald eagle just took off right from there. But I want to tell you about one particular moment when I was on this retreat. In most monasteries, at the end of the last prayer service of the day, called Compline, as the monks are leaving the chapel, the abbot, the head monk, the top dog, will usually take a small amount of holy water and sprinkle it on or near those present as a way of blessing the people and praying that they have a peaceful, restful, and safe night. Oftentimes, it's just sort of done like this. Now, although it differs depending on which monastery you're at. Now, as the evening service ended one night and the abbot began blessing us with the water, a couple of drops landed on my cheek. My initial split-second reaction was to be a little surprised and startled. But then as I sat in the silence with my eyes closed and just felt that water on my face, I experienced something so warm and loving that I can describe it as, well, blessing. Much like that night years back when a profound sense of peace came over me after pouring my anger and frustration into that journal, in that moment, I just felt welcomed, loved, and at peace as that water just gently rested on my face. And as I look back at that moment and so many other moments that I've been privileged to experience, I give so much credit to the silence. The complete silence I experienced at that monastery by the Hudson enabled me to see what I so often ignore and to hear what is so often drowned out by all the noise in my life. And what I saw and heard in the silence is that I am truly blessed, not simply by the drops of holy water that landed on my face, but by the fact that I am alive, that I have love and friendship in my life, and that I am able to share my life and my journey with my family, with my friends, and with those I minister alongside. That's the sound silence makes in my life. And that's the door silence has opened for me, a doorway to blessing. So I leave you this morning, as I leave you this morning, let me simply offer this blessing. And no, don't take your umbrellas out. No holy waters coming your way. May all of you, may each and every one of you find time for silence in the midst of all the noise and distractions of life. May you listen deeply to the stirrings of your heart and for that still small voice that lives within each of us. And may you always feel loved and celebrated for who you are. There is beauty and blessing within us and among us. Let silence be your doorway into connection with that beauty and blessing. Let that still small voice, whatever it may be, let it be your guide and your companion. Like I said, I don't know what the voice is. I don't know where it comes from. I don't think that matters. But I do know this, that still small voice is ultimately a voice of love and compassion. And it is waiting for all of us. So listen for it in the silence. That's what I have to say this morning. Thank you so much for listening, and blessed be.